I am very happy today to be introducing Professor Kristina Hill. Kristina received her Master's in Landscape Architecture and her PhD from Harvard University. And since then has had a very geographically varied career, starting at the University of Washington in Seattle, where I got to know her as a student, to the University of Virginia, and now at Berkeley in California, where she is currently the director of the Urban and Regional Institute for Urban and Regional Development. Now, as a young landscape architect student in the 1990s, Kristina represented, to me, I guess, I don't know, a new direction, if you will, for what I thought of at the time as a rather ossified field. By that I mean, she was integral to helping me connect the dots or establish the relationship between the built environment, ecosystem health, and personal health or community health. I still remember we read Sandra Steingraber's Living Downstream, which was a very intimate account of the buildup of environmental toxins in the environment and the author's personal struggles with cancer. By the way, Sandra, I think I'm not sure, but I think she was on the faculty here at Ithaca College for a long time, I believe, so local connection there. Kristina was also charitable enough to allow or encourage or invite several of us master's students to participate and collaborate on her first book, Ecology and Design, Frameworks for Learning, which I was very grateful for, and hopefully she was happy with our particular contribution to that effort. Since that time, she has expanded her research portfolio, looking at shifting groundwater patterns, coastal sea level rise, and adaptation practices, which is the topic of today's talk. She was then, as she is now, heavily involved in local government and sits on a number of state and local advisory boards around environmental issues. She speaks and lectures internationally and continues to innovate in terms of pedagogical approaches to engaging students in extremely complex topics and issues. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Hill. Thank you.
So I have 3 things that I want to talk about. And I'm working on a book, so pardon me, it's going to be a little dense. When you're at that stage where you know too much and you're giving talks on different topics to different people, I wanted to talk about the recent science and the observations that we're making about change in cities that may not seem obvious. I noticed there's a field guide to the city, or a kind of city observation course here in the department taught by your chair. Sounds great. Just walking by in the hallway, noticed it. And I just wanted to say that is so important to look, because we're going to see unexpected changes. And I hope today maybe I'll be able to help you imagine what to look for in some of these changes. And then the second part of the talk is history, talking about when sea level rise happened last time on a big scale to some of the first cities in the world in Mesopotamia. Which I've been doing a lot of research on. That was kind of my COVID project, to try to figure out what happened last time sea level rise rose rapidly. And then the last part is proposals for adaptation. So the hybrids that I'm talking about today are really wet-dry hybrids. And as you see in this slide, the way we've built cities over the last 100+ years is with an assumption of a dry crust of land that we assume is going to be dry down 10, 15, 20 feet. And we build everything into that crust with a lot of assumptions literally built in. So I wanted to say that I come to urban design and urban planning and landscape architecture from geology. And when you have training in geology, you always see the world a little bit weird. This is an exam question. This drawing is an exam question. It would be handed to you in a structural geology class, and the instructor would say, go. So you can see I've had to learn a different language, and it has really shaped my view. And as I was ending my geology education, we were just getting into hydrogeology for contaminated sites. So that has really stuck with me also, understanding that in that complexity, there's water. And that has really shaped the way I look at things. So I was not surprised to see the Dutch thinking about groundwater as part of their sea level rise adaptation back in 2009. Dutch groundwater is what I would call domesticated. They decide what level the groundwater is going to be, and they make it so, because the country is full of pumps. And that's part of why they're below sea level rise. When you pump, old marshland soils collapse, which is also part of why a lot of New Orleans is below sea level. So they have pumped, and they know a lot about groundwater, but the compound flooding that we're really designing for in adaptation is rain, river flooding, so rain that happens somewhere else up in might be a watershed a country away, and then sea level rise and groundwater rise. So it's this squeeze from 4 directions that real adaptation should be addressing, and unfortunately we're also siloed in the way that we approach this topic that real adaptation is not addressing this combination of topics, and that's going to cause it to fail. So I want to talk a little bit about the science. Why are those 4 directions so important? And just share a couple of new papers and then get into the groundwater work. This paper just came out in January 2024 from one of my UC colleagues, University of California, and he is pointing out that tidal water is already jacking up ice sheets in Antarctica. Anything you read about something unexpected being observed in Antarctica is a bad sign, and it means we need to think about higher potential sea level rise. So his research points out that we may be looking at a potential 11 feet sooner than we thought, or at least that we're tracking the highest level of sea level rise globally. This research by Lee and Ding, also UC system faculty, I get a newsletter, so I have a tendency to be a little biased towards UC Berkeley research. They are looking at rainfall patterns, and what they're seeing is atmospheric river events, which are these very extreme kind of hoses of rain, atmospheric rivers. They have been moving north. So this red shows an increase in frequency and the blue a decrease. So you can see it's going up towards Seattle and British Columbia and Alaska. It's going up towards you all here in the upper northeast. You're going to get more rain. Places above 30 degrees latitude are going to get more rain than they have historically, more intense storms. And you probably have seen that. So that's not a surprise, but it's nice to actually see the data and see that it's a global pattern and that it's about having more moisture in the air with a warmer atmosphere. Now I want to talk about groundwater, and what you'll notice in this is one of the very first studies in North America on rising groundwater, where our groundwater is not domesticated, it's wild. It's free range. We have no idea where it is. It's not mapped. It's not thought of as a resource. I'm talking about shallow, unconfined groundwater that's got all the dirty stuff in it that washes off of streets, farm fields. I'm not talking about the deep aquifers we use for drinking water. I'm talking about the shallow stuff that's dirty and not seen as a resource. So that shallow stuff, this is a study that was done for New Haven, as the sea rises, it's kind of sticking its saltwater toe into the 3-dimensional volume of the land. Like you're on the couch and you've got your toe under the pillow, and you lift your toe up, the pillow goes up. So the freshwater groundwater is going to rise as this toe presses farther inland and upwards. A heavier ocean pushes the saltwater wedge farther under the freshwater, and you get a response from the freshwater, and it goes up. So now you know more than most people who are doing climate adaptation work. Right there. Now you know more. This is a map that shows that study for New Haven. It shows 3 feet of sea level rise here at the shoreline, and then it extends, the influence of that rise in sea level extends as far as 3 miles inland. So it's not the same amount of groundwater rise as you go away from the shore zone. It would be the same at the shore zone and probably within, 1,000 feet or half a mile, but it tapers as it goes inland. And yet it's super important for us to anticipate that, Because again, we've built cities into this dry crust of land that we expect to stay dry, but won't. This is a paper we did recently in 2023 about how shallow the groundwater is around the Bay Area. This shows all the areas where, in the light blue, where groundwater is within 3 meters or about 10 feet of the surface. That's a lot. That is a lot of flat land. And that flat land, that 10 feet of dry crust, is going to get wet. And it's not going to behave the same way. A lot of things are going to change. Let me just go through this little cartoon I use for public audiences to show you. So shallow groundwater sits on top of that saltwater toe. That's the dark blue. There's a levee here and a road, a dry creek bed, because I'm showing you California, and some legacy contaminated soil that's been capped with a parking lot and a sewer pipe. As the saltwater rises, even though the levee is there, the freshwater groundwater also rises. It starts to touch these contaminants in the soil, starts to have the creek be full of water more of the year or just more full of water. The sewer pipe allows more water in, which means that that sewer pipe's capacity is not available for taking rainwater away or taking human waste away. Its capacity is being taken up by the groundwater. And then eventually you see more water in the creeks, maybe creek flooding, more inundation, less capacity in the pipes, and at the last stage you see it on the surface. By the time you see it on the surface, lots of things have happened in 10 feet of what used to be dry soil. So seeing it, what we call emergent, means that a lot of bad things have already happened. This is an example of something that happened 2 years ago in Oakland, where mixed-use housing development, not mixed-use, mixed income, half affordable, half market rate, called Coliseum Connections, was built in a flat area. I told them there was a problem. They did not listen to me. It's this area near the Oakland Coliseum. It's this site that was built. It's right next to the bay, San Francisco Bay. And the groundwater is very high here. It's going to be a big issue for whoever redevelops that site. It's very flat, very shallow groundwater, and it's in the FEMA flood zone. So we had this very heavy rain. We had an atmospheric river rain event. A lot of rain came in a short amount of time. The groundwater is already high. So you've probably heard of this sponge city thing. Not when the groundwater is really high. The sponge is already full. You won't be getting any more water in that. So the water came down from the hills up here, flooded this site. The crazy developer put the electrical in the basement. I thought we'd all learn not to do that. But he put the electrical in the basement, and everybody's been flooded out for, I think, 8 months after that, and have only just begun to return, and there was mold and damage to the electrical system. So it's been very expensive. And we have a housing crisis, so that's a big problem for us, that people are building in ways that aren't ready for this compound flooding phenomenon. And we're not even seeing that much sea level rise yet. This is a situation in the city of San Leandro, just south of Oakland, where at every high astronomical tide, what we sometimes call the king tide on the west coast, the groundwater bubbles up through the maintenance holes and causes spot flooding. So we're seeing it emerge at the surface, and you know what that means. That means a lot of things have already happened in that 10 feet below where we've built the city, the roots of the city. Here's another one in Alameda, city of Alameda. The same bubbling happened here. This was at the end of the high tide. This is the maximum spot flooding, or almost the maximum that occurred. And then the water drained away again as the tide went down. But this street is actually going to be closed. It's the first infrastructure decision to close a street in the whole San Francisco Bay Area as a result of rising sea levels. So this high tide is a sign that as those high tides get higher, every inch, more and more of this street would flood. So they decided to close it. This is a street in New Zealand, in Christchurch, where I was there in 2016. They had a high tide and a low pressure weather system. And this is the Pacific Ocean coming up through the drain, through the stormwater drain we've designed to take the rainwater away. It wasn't even raining. It was just low atmospheric pressure and a high tide. And this poor woman is out there trying to get leaves out of the drain because she thinks that's going to let the puddle go away. But it's coming up from the drain. So really, really important to understand that that's a possibility. In a lot of places in California, we're now seeing seaweed in the gutter and rust in the gutter after seawater has come up through the drain, like Miami. This is sometimes saltwater, sometimes fresh. In Honolulu, they're seeing a lot of problems. In the Mapunapuna Road area of Honolulu, they see water mains, so pressurized water pipes. I don't usually think of them as affected by water underground because the water in the pipe is under pressure. Groundwater can't leak in. But apparently tidally influenced groundwater is rising and falling in the backfill under the pipe, pulling out the fines from the backfill. The pipes settle and they break at the joint. So even brand new water pipes have broken and flooded areas because the groundwater is moving up and down every day through the tidal cycle. And then this one is a scary one. This is a power outage that occurred after an explosion underground and a fire fused a whole bunch of electrical wires. In Hawaii, they have, because of the military presence and industrial activities, they have a lot of petroleum on the surface of the groundwater. And that petroleum, as it gets wet by salt water, degrades to methane gas and hydrogen sulfide, both very explosive at certain concentrations. So they're seeing some underground explosions that are affecting electrical systems, and a maintenance worker could be down there, cause a spark, opening a door, and there could be loss of life as well. So we're seeing impacts from salt water moving up into contaminated soils, salt water rising and falling below pipes, and the combination of rain and salt water. This is the paper that we did in 2023 showing how many contaminated sites in the San Francisco Bay Area alone are sitting over rising groundwater. And there are more than 5,000. Of those, about 1,400 are actually still open. The other ones still often have contaminants. And many of them are in low-income areas that used to be redlined. So there's an environmental justice issue about which ones are still active and present, still have a lot of contaminant, and then which ones are vulnerable to rising groundwater. Because as the groundwater rises, that contaminant can move around, get into sewer pipes, enter buildings, cause all kinds of problems for people as well as the bay. This is the city of Richmond. It's actually a delta, so looking at it from a geological perspective, I see the point where the Wildcat Creek used to come down in different distributary channels over the last 15,000 years. Those are like nature's pipes. Those paleo channels are sorted sands and gravels. Groundwater comes down through them faster, piles up at the bottom, at the tips of these fingers, and right there it's all dense urban fill. So the groundwater backs up and rises in the ends of those fingers. And that is where a lot of industrial sites are, like this one, a very polluted site, like a cornucopia of all the worst possible toxic chemicals. And this is during another astronomical high tide. These are the old lagoons, a lot of poison in there. This whole capped site has volatile organic compounds that have leaked into buildings around here, very bad things happening. And I went after a rainstorm, and at a high tide and rainstorm combination, this lagoon travels out of the pond and into the city sewer system, right there. Totally unexpected connection, nobody designed for that. That's super toxic water going into people's sanitary sewers. And the gas component can travel uphill into your house or a school. So we're very concerned about these combinations of things. I'm almost to the end of the science part. I'm going to get to the history. So this cross-section shows, again, an area of contaminated soil, a creek bed, a sewer pipe going to a sewer in the lower part of the street, storm sewers, foundations for a building. As the sea level rises, that groundwater is going to come up, and the thing people are going to do is pump. They're going to pump to lower the groundwater around their lower levels of the building, especially any parking garage or something subgrade. And as they pump, they're going to draw the salt water up. They're going to not only have an impact on potentially pulling contaminated soils towards themselves, but they're going to cause this phenomenon called upconing, where you bring the saltwater boundary up. And to pump down by a foot can bring the saltwater boundary up as much as 40 feet. because you've changed the pressure relationship and the density difference between salt water and fresh water. So we are going to totally mess up these building foundations that were not designed to be in salt groundwater. And suddenly they are. And a lot of people think that the condominium collapse in Florida from a few years ago, the tragic collapse in Miami, was partly caused by salt water, groundwater affecting the building's foundations in addition to other design errors. So I'm at the point where I want to describe the last time this happened, because I want to get to talking about what we should do next. And as I became obsessed about all these different problems that we're going to see, I thought, well, this must have happened somewhere before. We must have a human story about how we've adapted to this in the past. So thinking like a geologist, I wanted to remind myself and everybody that the very first cities occurred during this period, or emerge during this period when sea level rise was very slow. This is 24,000 years of sea level rise. There have been very fast periods like meltwater pulse 1A. That's what we're kind of afraid is our scenario that we're facing next. Relatively slow, and then a very slow period over the last 8,000 years where all the world's big deltas formed. During the period where sea level was about at the same spot and the rivers bringing sediment to the shoreline piled up the sediment at one spot where they met the sea. So in one of those places in the Persian Gulf, there's a very shallow kind of tongue at the end of the Persian Gulf, and that filled in kind of quickly in geologic terms over 7,000 to 8,000 years. And as that Persian Gulf water rose, some archaeologists think that that drove people to form cities in the first place, to form centralized areas instead of being nomadic, because they lost their kind of fertile plain there. And they built these cities that were in a wetland condition along these two rivers with the Persian Gulf in this area that's now dry. So the climate has changed on them. They used to live in an area where there was a low river in the middle of a big flat plain, and then the water table, the Persian Gulf level rose, the water table became higher, and then the area of the estuary actually filled in with sediment brought down by those rivers in Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, delivered all that sediment, and people lived in these wetlands with gravel and sands brought down by the river in a very high water condition, a very high groundwater condition. Now it's all desert because, just like today, we're seeing the atmospheric river events move north, the monsoon belt moved. And now they don't get monsoons in Mesopotamia the way they did 6,000 years ago. So they developed these incredible techniques for managing river flows that are very, very old. This photo shows from the British colonial era how they used these big reed bundles as movable dams, like what the Dutch build or what's built in London to protect the city. A movable storm surge barrier, in this case, a movable dam that they could close to raise the level of the water on the upstream side and irrigate fields or allow people to navigate boats with higher water. The fate of entire cities depended on being able to do this, because if the river jumped its banks and went a different way and your city was high and dry, you're cut off from trade, you're cut off from any kind of influence, because that's how everybody got around. So these are very, very important technologies that are probably ancient. And in fact, the woman who pulled these photos out of an archive, Stephanie Roast, she read the cuneiform documents, you know, those marks pressed into clay tablets from 4,000 years ago. And they say the budgets and the number of people and the number of reed bundles. It's amazing how much detail there is about this practice. And new archaeological research by Emily Hammer, who's at Penn, using magnetic gradiometry, they walk these landscapes and they're able to see, not by digging trenches and a laborious process of archaeological discovery, but by mapping the different soils, they're able to see the magnetic properties of the soils, reveal where there were buttresses for walls, where there might have been a gate in the walls, where there were streets, where there were houses. So they can actually see houses and drains and streets and canals and walls through the magnetic data that they get from this new technique. They mapped that, or she mapped it, onto aerial photography and was able to show that the cities in Mesopotamia at that time were decentralized cities in this mix of rivers that move their banks, jump their banks occasionally, canals, ponds, harbors, that it's partly constructed. These light blue are the canals. The dark blue are probably channels that they influenced. This whole thing is a watery suburban landscape that people adapted to and got everywhere by boat, and had floating buildings throughout these neighborhoods. And it's a practice that was only interrupted in the 1970s to use reeds to build floating structures and build the houses themselves out of reeds. A model of one was built at Rice University a few years ago to show that technique for how to build entire buildings out of reeds. Their religious beliefs and cosmology was all connected to groundwater. This is the god Enki here with the wings. This is Enki with the fish. That's sort of like a precursor to the idea of angels, an intermediary with the gods. But this is the god Enki with the fish coming up and over him. And his domain is the underworld, but it's a wet underworld. His domain is really the underground groundwater. And people believe that we are born from the groundwater, human beings, and after we die, we go back to the groundwater. Really beautifully connected. And they were very clever about how to work with water. This is an image from one of the king's panels at Nimrud in Iraq, what's now Iraq, and shows someone using a goat skin as a bladder to be able to swim, a soldier, to swim underwater in a river, probably sneak up on somebody. But they were very clever and brave about water. And the symbol for the god Enki was a goat fish. It was a hybrid animal. They had a lot of hybrid animals. Lion women, bird lions, lion men, horse women. There were all kinds of hybrids that they used to speak in code to each other in a kind of symbolic code about what matters and how to think about it. And what they were talking about with the goat fish, which later became the sign of Capricorn, was the ability to be as clever as the goat, but in water. So really cool that they tried to code these things that way and then turn it into something that was a code they could speak to each other about how important it was to be a goat fish. And then, of course, we have our indigenous American model, which is the floating city of Tenochtitlan, where some of the temple heavier stone structures are on islands, but the rest of the city is floating. And the roads were sometimes on berms with floating bridges, sometimes floating entirely. And all that's left is a little area of Chinampas at Xochimilco. But it was in a very extensive system, and they were so clever about how they used the water. Some of this was saltier because of evaporation, kind of like the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Some of it was saltier water. They separated that from fresh with these berms. They separated human liquid wastes and solid wastes from fresh. You had to know where to go empty your bucket. There were only certain places where you could dump waste. So they were very clever about how to live with this lake condition, probably for defensive reasons, but also for part of their cosmology. And it's much loved as an icon of what Mexico and the Mexica people were like before the colonial era. This Diego Rivera model, mural is a famous one from Mexico City also. And you can see there the patches of floating homes. They used reeds in a similar way to the way that people in Mesopotamia used reeds for boats, for housing. And then, of course, we have Amsterdam, which is essentially a 13th century, 14th century city built where a river came into a lake at a delta, and the canals were used to keep the groundwater lower in the blocks between the canals. They would actually do light horizontal pumping, and still do, to pull groundwater out of those adjacent blocks in the 17th century. And if they hadn't pumped, it would have just been a big pond. So they had to introduce pumping as a way to actually keep the groundwater a little bit lower when they first built those blocks. And what I love about Amsterdam's approach at that time is the motto written on this building from 1638, the costs come before the benefits. How come we have such a hard time understanding that in 2024, sorry. So hybrid adaptation. This is a set of proposals and some actual projects from the Netherlands showing how we might hybridize wet and dry to do what the Dutch call living with higher water, or living with water, rather than trying to wall it out. We are still in the wall it out phase here in the United States. The San Francisco Bay Area is talking about big levees. They would have wetlands on the bay side, but otherwise they are pretty conventional levees. And San Francisco is building a $13 billion seawall for other reasons related to seismic stuff too. But the Dutch have been trying experiments. They've learned a lot from these pilot projects. This one is one of my favorites. It's in Nesselande outside of Rotterdam. And the city excavated these ponds, artificial ponds, that reveal the water table. They also provide several feet of flood capacity as a kind of stormwater wet pond for stormwater to come from the rest of the surrounding area. So they built infrastructure that protects the older part of the city, and then they sold land in it to rich people to build houses in the infrastructure that protects everybody else. This should be an American story. And they get people, I'll just share this quickly, they get people who, when they see a little erosion happening in the levee on the side, they are going to call someone. Poor people do not call someone about things like that the way that rich people do. They are the ultimate monitoring device. This is another example. These aren't, none of these are floating. This one and the last one aren't floating. They're on pile foundations in the mud. But you can see how the Dutch are embracing this idea of having land and water be mixed. And they're talking about it horizontally. We have to also think about it vertically, where we have this wild groundwater. No one really knows where it's going to go. This is a project called the Waterbert in the neighborhood of Steiger Island. And these are all 3-story prefabricated floating units, actually floating and attached to piles, and the piers themselves are fixed. So the units are houseboats, but they're not like American houseboats where we have a barge on the bottom. The pontoon is actually occupiable space. So you can live in the bottom floor. You can't have a bedroom, but you can have an office or living space. This is the future of that proposal by the Dutch. They're now working as the consultants to the world, in particular the Maldives. Because they've done the pilot projects, they know how these things work, what do you have to do to make one of these things. And the Maldives have bought into the idea that they can have a kind of artificial lagoon, dredged sand placed as a barrier to waves, and then inside that artificial pond, they could have a floating city, a floating community. Let me put it that way, not a city. So in California, we are talking about looking at sea level rise as a series of adaptation lifts. So the next 40 years, we have to get up about 3 feet if we're tracking that most impactful potential sea level rise trend. The next 40 years would have to be 6 feet. The next 40 years, it has to be 9 feet. So the purpose of what we do now should not be to fill the cracks in the bathtub and kick the can down the road to the next generation, but should actually be to be piloting things like the Dutch are so that we're ready for the 6-foot change and then the 9-foot change without losing a lot of value. Because cities that lose their tax base by losing industry, commercial, and housing will not have as much money to adapt. Cities in the United States are going to have to borrow because that's our system. We're going to borrow to do adaptation, and you have to have value to borrow. That's your capital, is your tax base. So we're talking about what we can do as a hybrid of dry and wet. And Rich Haig, a famous landscape architect, told everybody, you know, the essence of landscape architecture is dig hole, make mound. So there you are. Now you know the essence of landscape architecture. The secret is out of the bag. If you dig and excavated an artificial pond and then place that material, you can get your wetland wedge, and you can get something to float in that actually turns out to be pretty effective for thinking about seismic events, which is a big factor for us in the Pacific Rim. Over the years, I've had students over the last almost, well, I guess 8 years now, do different visualizations of what that could be like. If there was a big wetland on the outside of the levees, low levees, really low levees, and then ponds back here, a kind of band of ponds that allow for buildings to float. And you can float on shared decking. I think I have an example of that coming up. So if you stack prefabricated units on shared decking, instead of having each floating structure be on its own buoyant pontoon, you don't have to worry about which wall the piano goes on and which wall the bookcase goes on, which you do in floating houses, because it's like you're on a big snowshoe, and you get a lot more buoyancy from the shared decking. And if it's modular, the whole thing can be prefab units, modular decking, modular pontoons, could be installed and taken apart and relocated. This pond is at a tributary. Here's the compound flooding I'm talking about. Rain comes off of the hills and the streets, goes into the river. That's going to have space that needs to flood to expand outside its banks during a flood. Tidal water is going to be coming up. Groundwater is going to be coming up. All three of those kinds of flooding are going to happen right here where the tributary meets the bay. There is no other strategy that is prepared for all three kinds of flooding besides being in a pond. For a competition we did in 2018 with CMG and AECOM, they made some cartoons like this to talk about it. It's a mosaic of ponds, not one big one, because one big one is hard to manage with wave energy and erosion from wind. And it's separated from the bay itself because our environmental laws are so strict in the Bay Area and across the US, we could never put floating housing on the bay. But we can dig artificial ponds and float things on those and have fresh water come in at the top through a tide gate and go back out through the bottom. That's what it would take. You'd have to flush these ponds with fresh water and tidal water. They would have some mechanical component. They're not a paradise of lotus flowers. They are a managed system. And this is a cross-section to show we're talking about high groundwater. They're not showing the pile foundations these buildings would need. We're having a lot of debate about, in a seismically active region, can we have pile foundations that justify the height of the building? The expense will be higher, so they may need to be more mid-rise buildings. But 3 stories is perfectly reasonable for the floating component. You can get to a density of 100 units per hectare pretty easily. 75 units per acre is not impossible if you make them flats instead of townhouses. And then we've done some different demonstrations of what that could look like, very kind of more free-form, naturalistic, and then things that are much more based on the urban grid. And these canals, like the Dutch canals, could actually help us keep groundwater levels low in existing neighborhoods so that people who were able to buy their first house ever, African-American people, Latino people, living in this area can stay there longer because we're protecting them by selling this stuff to wealthier people. So that's the idea. Let me just show you how one of those would change over from low tide, here's all the shared decking and prefab units, to mean tide, to high tide. And at our high tide, a lot of these landforms become isolated, the berms. And then with sea level rise, you can see that the landforms start to sort of dissipate and look a little overwhelmed. As the berms get too wet, you would have to relocate the pond. So the strategy proposal is to start with a band of ponds with a wetland edge and tributaries, build a second band of ponds after 40, 50 years, and then fill in the old ponds with the cut from the new ponds to make the wetland edge that the Bay Area really, really wants for biodiversity and for wave protection. And then eventually build the new band of ponds and keep rolling the carpet back in phases so that investors can continue to invest in housing with some certainty over a period of 30 to 50 years. And you keep rolling back. So it's not retreat, because if we retreat, where does the money come from to clean up all the contaminated sites, pull foundations out of the ground, pull pipes out of the ground? There's no money for it. But it's managed retreat in a way that's also what we call adaptation in place. So we're adapting in place, we're changing things, and as conventional districts start to fail, we're introducing the pond mosaic and the floating and the water management. And then we have to prove to people all over the Bay Area that floating works and explain how it works, because no one seems to know. So we make these physical models to try to demonstrate to people that how floating works. We didn't think we'd be in that conversation, but in fact we are. So maybe I'll stop there. Thank you for your patience, and see if there are questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Hill. My name's Joanna, and I'm a visiting lecturer in planning. And I just had a question, actually, about this slide. Those houses, I assume the light blue those are communities on those ponds?
So that would be the shared decking footprint.
And is that relocatable as you roll back?
Yes. There's no reason why the decking and the pontoons can't be relocatable.
And I just wonder about the sort of legal implications around tenure, like land tenure and things like that, how would that legal infrastructure have to be changed to allow for those things to be relocated? We're
seeing it as a land trust that you can buy into and then have equity, a capped amount of equity, develop over time. And people would know that they had 30, 40 years, that that's what they're buying into. Okay. Kind of like a timeshare that might expire. Thank you. That's what I'm thinking of. And go ahead, yeah.
I was just going to follow up on the same map. Phenomenon we have on the East Coast, see it in Asia maybe, not so much on the West Coast, is storm surge. Yep. So what happens when a 20-foot wall of water comes?
Right, well, if these are done appropriately, the levee on the outboard side and around these, this one has a little gap for a tide gate, but in fact it would probably be continuous all around it, more like these are shown. As the storm surge overtops the levees, there's no damage necessarily to the pond. It's just moving some earth around after the storm surge. And the things that are in the pond would still float. It would be waves that could cause the damage. And if it's prefabricated units on shared decking that's modular, it should be repairable. So the key would be finding the right materials and mass production technique to be able to have it be repairable at a reasonable cost.
But not necessarily safe during the waves.
No, you would have to evacuate. Like very smart Cajun people do in New Orleans, you evacuate during the storm. You're aware of your environment. You're not separated by a seawall from the ocean so that you get dumber and dumber with each passing decade, not seeing what's changing around you. You're looking at the water and you're ready.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm a first-year MRP student. Thank you for your presentation. So my question is kind of in regards to like the cost of home insurance, specifically in areas where I think this would be used is like going up, and it's completely absurd, and it's really difficult to get home insurance like costs down, especially on like prefabricated homes. So like I'm just curious about how these models would be like feasible for affordability, or is affordability not the goal?
No, I mean affordability is still the goal. We'd
Okay.
like it to be something that would be mixed income.
Yeah.
That would be the best, because we don't want to just have rich people in the nice water view area. But the trick is figuring out how to work with FEMA and the insurance companies on this new model. There is insurance for houseboats, so there is a precedent.
Oh, okay.
And in California, there's a thing called the Geologic Hazard Abatement District. So landowners can vote. If these were land trusts, they can decide to join and form a geologic hazard abatement district. Then they have their own insurance pool, and they're actually exempt from the State Environmental Quality Act.
Okay.
So they can move mud around, move dirt around, without having to get approval through the state's permitting system. They still would need federal permits if they're dealing with the open bay, but it really simplifies the process. So I think what the East Coast needs in the Southeast is a high groundwater environmental overlay zone, so that you could talk about what you can do in there, maybe modeled after California's Geologic Hazard Abatement District.
Thank you.
There's a mic coming up.
Another quick question. A few years ago, we took CRP students to Boston, and at City Hall, they have a great model of the city. And one speaker pointed out all of the areas with former warehouses and train lines that were going to get redeveloped. And then the next speaker talked about all the areas of Boston that are going to flood in the next 40 years. And guess what?
Same area.
Same areas.
Yeah. We have to get smarter, and I think not be so intimidated by the maximum water level, but find a way to live with water that tolerates some interruption. Because you could never, if you design for the maximum water levels, storm surge plus sea level rise, you have to leave. And then you lose value. The strategy here is to conserve value while you do rational things. And people are given rational expectations about how long they can occupy a zone. Question up on the top?
Oh, hello, I'm Elena. I'm also a first-year MRP. Thank you for being here. And my question is, what's the biggest hurdle you feel like is with convincing people that this is a solution? I'd imagine that people are very skeptical to live on top of water. Just curious what you've run into so far.
We actually have a lot of people who live on water in places like Sausalito. So we have houseboat communities. This is actually, I think, better than that because you don't feel any sway if you have the shared decking. I think the biggest hurdles aren't living on water, although certainly there are single moms with 3 kids who have felt completely overburdened and overwhelmed, and they don't want to live on the water. So they need to be protected in the areas behind these developments. But what the biggest hurdle is I'm talking about needing a redevelopment authority, and California eliminated those about 10 years ago when Jerry Brown was governor. So we have no redevelopment authority capacity for government, and we need to use eminent domain. And I think we should use it when conventional buildings start to fail, because then their market value goes real low. That's a good time to buy. So they need to have rules against that limit things and regulate them, like pumping. Pumping is bad for the whole community, brings up the saltwater boundary, but it's not regulated or tracked. So if pumping at the property level at the parcel level was regulated and tracked, they could try to prevent it, then those buildings would fail, and then they could buy them.
Thank you.
So that's how I'm thinking about getting there. But eminent domain is still very controversial. And we're facing an incredible global crisis. If we don't use every muscle we have, we're not going to make it. We're going to leave polluted ruins in the zone that floods. So world's smallest violin for public officials who are afraid of eminent domain. We have to use every tool in the toolbox.
Hi, I'm Sam, a second-year MRP. I was kind of curious about, how do you do participative planning, with saying to a community, hey, this is what's going to happen, here's how we can help. How do you go about that process of participative planning with a community that is vulnerable to sea level rise and that could benefit from
You
this?
know, you can't, we've been working in a community called San Rafael, in the Canal District of San Rafael, which is mostly Latino immigrants from Guatemala, Mexico, and we're trying to help them think about the future, and it's one step at a time, because they all want to move out of there. So they're not seeing themselves there long term. It depends on the community you're talking to. If it's an immigrant community getting its first step in a country that wants to move on to someplace in the suburbs, that's a different conversation than if it's people in their 70s whose house is their bank account and their retirement. So you have to have different conversations with different people. But one thing I have done, which I think works, is working in California, is I give lots of presentations to community groups to tell them what the issues are. They talk to each other. They get me invited to be part of state advisory panels. So when they hear, oh, that Dr. Hill, she shows these great slides, you need to hear her talk. And then I get onto the state sea level rise advisory board or the Bay Area's adaptation advisory board. So now I can bring up the issues in a setting where there's decisions being made to try to create a path for this adaptation strategy to go on, to move forward. So that's what I've been doing, is creating a kind of army of advocates who think about the topic. They get me invited to participate in changing the rules, change the rules, and then look and see, okay, are there developers who'll put capital in and build these things? But that's the last step. Even though land use control is local, the state is very restrictive in California, so you really have to start at the state level. I hope that clarified. You work with different people on what their issue is. If I go in and say, let's build housing for rich people on ponds, that's a non-starter at that level. You have to start where the people are. I could go to Google and give that pitch. They would like it.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk and proposal. We have such a crisis in this country around maintenance. I think you spoke to that yourself. Maintenance of public infrastructure, maintenance of privately owned buildings. It just seems like a real issue around collective maintenance of places. What's the secret or the recipe to address those issues of maintenance over the long term?
I think your new things that are delicate and that might have problems and need to go through a shakedown period, they need to be done for wealthier people. Because they will complain and they will support the idea that it should be fixed. But I think in poor neighborhoods, people have gotten so, it's become normalized that there's illegal dumping and there's shuttered buildings and things are broken. It's very different. So I think they need to get investments on the public works side, and the new housing could be investments that we treat as infrastructure with all the financing and banking ideas that go with infrastructure, some public-private partnerships. But we have to have enough tax base to put the public dollars into the neighborhoods that are on the verge and don't have advocates. It's so clear in the Bay Area how entrenched the unlevel playing field is, where the city council member who represents this poor area is in the pocket of some big, like Pacific Gas and Electric, gets their child a job at Pacific Gas and Electric, but pays no attention to the need to advocate for their neighborhood. It's very entrenched. Our democracy is not working at that level where there's an unlevel playing field. We have to find some other way to draw attention to the public dollar needs. I don't know if you have an answer to that.
I hope that works. The public infrastructure over time.
If you look
like
at the
upfront.
if you look at the street tree problem, you know, where poor neighborhoods have almost no street trees and wealthy neighborhoods have all the beautiful street trees, typically, that's what it's like in California. That has to be because people are engaged. Those are in the right of way, but people get out and defend their tree. They don't want that tree trimmed in the wrong way. Or they might water things in California because they care more and want that environment, and they have time. Time is gold. If you have 3 jobs and you're driving all over the region to do construction, you don't have time to water the tree on your street. So time is an incredible resource that wealthy people have and poor people don't.
Another question right here. Thank you for your presentation. Down here, yeah. I guess this segues actually pretty well into my next question, which is structurally, we've been talking about some of these more specific issues, but I'm curious, do you see this solution as something that fits into our current systems, either financially or politically, or something that's still going to require a certain degree of a shift before it's going to be ready to be implemented?
I want the systems that we have to be different. I want there to be more land trusts so that we can talk differently about ownership, or other ownership models for apartment buildings, like what we see in, let's say, Germany, where there are more co-ops, and less of a focus on using your housing as your retirement account, because there might be more of a social safety net. But I can't make all those things change, so I see this as a kind of Trojan horse. If you can get the idea of land trusts and adaptation in place, and using people with more financial means to do things that will protect people with less financial means, I think we're moving in the right direction. And I hope that Americans would embrace it, because it seems like it makes sense. But you have to talk to people about where they're at. And if you say you want to totally redo the system, they'll say no.
Thank you.
My personal idol is Rosa Luxemburg. I want to be out there and change the system. But I'm trying to find ways to do it in a sneakier way.
And hello, my name is Yu Chenxie. I'm a first-year MRP student, and my question is: so this solution is mainly for coastline areas. So I'm wondering if this solution can be applied to the inland, because it's the inland flooding is also a question, and just wondering if so, and is there any similarity or difference in the solutions?
Yes, there are 2 really good strategies I've learned about for inland river flooding in flat landscapes. In really flat landscapes, this would be a good strategy. But the Japanese super dike, that is an amazing strategy. I haven't talked about it because it's more appropriate where you have a lot of gravel and steep rivers coming down from mountains, bringing gravel down, because they built not a super tall levee, but a super wide levee, like 4 or 5 times wider at the base than a typical levee. And then they rebuilt all the buildings on top. And now people have water views where they used to be behind a narrower, more fragile levee. And it can't fail catastrophically. That's one of the principles I think we need in adaptation, is it has to be what my colleague Nina Marie Lister in Canada has called safe to fail. If something goes wrong, if there's overtopping where water comes over the top, it can't crack and flood in minutes so that there's more risk of loss of life. It has to be a slow failure, not catastrophic. And I think this design fits that.
Kristina, you mentioned the sponge city. I'm curious to know if you've talked to Yukong Jen about his ideas and his take on your approach here. It seems like there could be conflict there in the ways you approach the problem.
Well, I think it is a geography. I haven't talked to Kong Jen for several years, but I think there is also a geography question of if you're in inland areas where the groundwater is sinking, sponge city makes a lot of sense. But I heard people from design firms come to the Bay Area and talk about sponge city in the South Bay. That makes no sense, because the sponge is full. And wetlands people sometimes describe as absorbing rainwater, but not at the coast. Wetlands at the coast are good for their roughness and for their biodiversity and their water filtration, but they don't allow water to sink into the soil. They're not a sponge. And we have to be smart enough as planners and designers to know the difference. Inland cities, low groundwater, absolutely do infiltration and sponge cities. Coastal cities, not so much.
Hello, I'm Balaji, first year MRP student. Thanks for your presentation, by the way. After going through your presentation, now I'm more curious about what's the research book is going to be about. Like, what's the update right now, and is it more about like guidelines, or what is it about, like the outcome?
What's the book about? Yeah. It ends up being about hybrids and landforms and how we can use landform, digging ponds, building wetland wedges, building super dikes, as a way to adapt. So it is this lecture in a way, with more attention to the changes in materials that have happened over time. We go so quickly to concrete with rebar now that I really want to help people imagine a world where that is not the first choice, because it can fail in a brittle fashion, and it's going to corrode. So I think we need to consider landform as a way to have something that's transformable. For example, in the Bay Area, when we talk about seawalls, when you build a wall, it has a foundation size to the height. You can't just add a bunch more wall on top when the sea continues to rise. If you build an earthen form, a dike or a mound, you can add to that without having to take away the original. So in my view, a landform is like a legacy. You can give that as a gift. A seawall is like a liability that future generations are going to have to rip out and completely replace.
Hello, here. My name is Jose Rodriguez. I'm here down.
Oh, sorry. There
Yes,
you are.
I'm doing the MPS in Global Development, and I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in the presentation that this is, of course, something that's going on all around the world, and maybe there are countries that don't have the resources to implement such a projects. For example, the case of Buenos Aires, they have a problems with the River of La Plata, similar to what you're mentioning. I was going to ask you, do you think there are strategies that maybe can be implemented that require less resources?
Yes, and I actually think that the landform strategy scales, because if you have labor, you can do landform. You don't have to hire the Dutch to come in with Dutch bulldozers. You can use a lot of people with shovels. So I think it actually translates and becomes a kind of jobs program, which is what the Japanese super dike project was. It was a jobs program during a recession in the late 90s. So I think that using landform provides us the opportunity to do this in different economic contexts, where buying concrete and steel movable storm surge gates, that does not translate. That's a liability for a country with lower income. You have to pay the debt off from that, and then you have to replace it when it's no longer sufficient. So I actually think this is a good strategy. And there are some, I'm not a technological optimist really, but there are some technologies coming where people are injecting wood chips in a water slurry 30, 100 feet below ground and elevating the ground. And that's something that could be done in different income level countries. It could be done to elevate a road, and then houses could be attached to that elevated road. It's especially good for seismic areas. So there are some good news things that are coming up as carbon sequestration and lifting technology, but I think that overall, cut and fill, dig hole, make mound is the way to go. And people in places like Bangladesh are already very clever about this, with floating agricultural beds. At the lowest income levels, maybe it's desperation, sadly, but people have to think about this, and they are. They just need some framework that helps them organize it and international money that would fund it. I think we'd see a lot of innovation with floating structures and landform if we gave people money to do it in places that are already low.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a first year MRP student. And it's super cool to hear that you've been doing work in the Bay Area, and I've grown up around that environment and seen like a lot of those like politics play out, which is really interesting, like in Marin and Palo Alto. So like places like Marin County is like one of the whitest like counties in California and has some of the biggest like economic discrepancies.
Yep.
So like there's like the ultra wealthy, and then there's places that are a lot poorer, like Marin City.
And Marin City is the only one that floods, the only African-American neighborhood and the only one that floods already.
So yeah, and it's very much like a lot of those like houseboats from what I've seen, and it's right on that water area, and it floods a lot. What I've noticed is like in certain places like Mountain View, like companies like Google are like, to get tax breaks, or maybe not tax breaks, but rewards from the city, they'll implement infrastructure to help with like greenery and flood mitigation and invest a lot of money into that. But how do you get residents to want to buy into this process of like, you mentioned like convincing the wealthier residents to be able to buy into the infrastructure and provide for the community? How do you convince them to buy into that if there's less at stake for places like Marin City, where they don't have like a lot of their assets? And in certain places like Menlo Park, like they were like a few years, like maybe 10 years ago, they didn't want to share like schooling money with like East Palo Alto, which was a predominantly Hispanic community. How do you like work with the community on that?
The Bay Area has a lot of problems of systemic racism and continuing prejudice. So most American communities do. And I think that the key is to give everybody a piece of what they want and frame it in the way that works for them. The African American community in Marin City, that's their only place. They want to stay. So they are 100% invested, even though they may live in public housing. So they are 100% invested in the identity of being from Marin City. Then you have people in Sausalito who want to continue being on houseboats, but the state is trying to shut that down because it shades important nearshore habitat areas. So they need a new place for the boats. I think that there are opportunities. There's a pond in Marin City. Maybe they can find a way to share, where the wealthy houseboats move to the pond, that pays for the renovation of public housing. We have to figure out who has the money and who pays and who benefits. Is there a Zoom question? Is that?
So there's a Zoom question. Have you seen strategies like this one work in communities where shoreline parcels are privately owned, as in Maine?
Yeah, all these Bay Area shoreline parcels I'm talking about are also privately owned. No one would do anything if the environment wasn't changing. There has to be a failure of the conventional for any of this to be on the table. No one wants change. They just want to keep taking money out of those apartments that they rent. It's a cash machine. So if there's going to be change, it has to be because of some failure. When buildings and pipes start to fail, then we talk about what we could do next. That's just how it is. And if private property owners want to get ahead of it, they see the writing on the wall, they've experienced hurricanes and storm surge, then maybe they do it sooner. The people who are in Florida right now who have to rebuild after 2 hurricanes in a row, how many times do you go through that before you decide to move? And then that land is up for sale and it's available. So I think that repeated events can drive this change, as well as gradual failure of discovering. For example, most communities, only Miami-Dade County, requires the inspection of foundations, building foundations, and that's only since that condo collapse. Nobody else requires inspection of foundations. If we required it, we would be able to red tag or close buildings and say they're unsafe, especially in an earthquake zone like ours, but also in storm surge areas. You could force people to change the building or sell the property. That's a muscle that communities have not been willing to use because they feel sorry for the person who owns that property. We need to give those people an out that saves them some kind of value, but doesn't keep them investing in the same spot. That's the tricky part. How do you give people a back door to get out of an impossible situation without, losing everything they have? And again, world's smallest violin for wealthy people who have a second house on the ocean. No pity, none at all. I'm sorry. On the Chesapeake Bay, if your house is in the critical zone of the high tides, or your septic tank is exposed by the tidal change because of rising sea levels or a storm, you've just got to take that house down at your own expense. That's the tough love you get in a state that believes in individual responsibility. You have to actually pay to remove your house. That's really expensive.
I have a question right here. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful talk. And you know, I love the way you've been able to walk us through sort of the history of an idea, technology, geology. I mean, you know, just think about context and time in different ways. It's fantastic. But you keep bringing up the wealthy, and it's a little.
I'm a communist.
No, I've actually thought a lot about this because it's easy to study poor people and impose ourselves on them, extremely difficult to get to the wealthy. And yet, of course, they're the ones who really control pretty much everything. And so, some of us are part of that wealthy 1%, and it's an interesting question. But I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, so forgive me for somewhat muddled thinking. But a little bit about where I'm coming to this question from. You know, I'm watching your diagram. I love that last diagram, right? It's time, and it gives you a whole set of ideas about levees, landforms, ponds, managed retreat. It's the kind of diagram that becomes a precedent in utopian planning models. Think Ebenezer Howard's diagram, which every planner knows. Now, the Ebenezer Howard diagram had behind it a whole structure for property ownership, which fell out of the picture when that diagram became suburbia. So what's really interesting to me, and then it was wealthy people, wealthy developers, right, who were creating suburbia, because of course, suburban development in the United States and in the UK is a partnership between real estate developers and the state. So what's interesting to me when you're showing that diagram and you're following a similar kind of a path, like a Howard in that diagram, you have a fantastic diagram. It's going to stick to me as a precedent. It tells me 3 things that I need to remember, but the 2 important pieces, right? One about land ownership, which relies on you talking about it, does not show up in the diagram, much like in Ebenezer Howard's case. Unless you read the book, you never understood that. And the second part for me is what this business of the wealthy, right? Instinctively, I think you're right. The wealthy watch. The wealthy keep people out. The wealthy warehouse those they don't like. They use, it's not the wealthy, but a capitalist system. I don't want to point at a wealthy person. It's a class-based structure. So it's to rely on that when we've seen again and again in the last 600 years of history, the manipulation of every model to not have it be equitable or public or shared in any sense of the term, is to me a really interesting dilemma. So I'm kind of curious, I'm thinking Earthsea Chronicles, Ursula, Le Guin, and I'm thinking this and I'm thinking that, and it's a fantastic talk. But when it comes back to the wealthy, I'd love to hear more about how you're really thinking about this.
Well, I'm kind of hoping Elon Musk goes to Mars.
He goes to Mars?
And takes a few people with him.
And never comes back. I would be in agreement on that.
Yes.
But
there are real cases of what you're talking about already, where Marin City, which was brought up in the earlier question, has a pond. It's like a bathtub with only one drain. And the pond has a tide gate. And the people who live in the Sausalito houseboats at one point put a bike lock on the tide gate so that the state couldn't open it before the flood came, because they felt that too much plastic trash came out of the pond where there's a mall around it with a Safeway that serves the low-income community. And that's because nobody services the trash cans. It's not because poor people are messy. But they put a bike lock on the tide gate. So I can imagine if there was a monkey wrenching that happened in the system I've proposed, where people who live in the ponds in the capital let the districts drown. by closing the tide gates or turning off the pumps that help move water out of your great-grandmother's house in East Oakland. So it is possible that there would be both formal and informal monkey wrenching that was part of that system. But I want there to be a more powerful state. I want there to be land trusts that have to work with public development authorities. And I want those public development authorities to have power. So I'm hoping that if there's competing power, private power and public power, that's why the governor got rid of California's public development agencies. He didn't like the competition between the redevelopment agencies and the city. So I think if that competition comes back, it would actually be a healthy thing. People build power in their group. So if that group is a public development authority versus a private land trust, I think that would be healthy. And if one becomes too powerful, I think that's bad. But to me, the failure of the Garden City diagram was they didn't show the smoke. If they had shown the smoke coming from the factories and other buildings burning coal, they would have realized everyone's going to want to go upwind, who has the capacity to choose. And the privatization, I think, is in part a reaction to the pollution. If this is cleaned up, people would be attracted to it. If it's the toxic soup because they didn't clean up the contaminated soils first, then they'll offer that to professors to live there, or somebody with less choice. Students and professors will be living in the ponds. It's a really good question, and I think any system can be hijacked by dominance.
Can I ask a follow-up?
I think Maria's had her hand up a few times.
Thanks, Kristina. That was fascinating and really well-grounded, and I think you gave us hope. There are many landscape architects here, but I don't know why they are not asking any question. I feel that it is very clear, although I don't think you stated so much, that you are also asking other disciplines to take a role on that and be more proactive. No? So I think most of the questions you have been listening today are more how to apply that. And I'm hoping that these new designers and planners will figure out a way to work together. I have a quick question, because you talked about toxicity, and I will check this article that I haven't checked. So are there other people, your own lab, your own research lab, working on trying to understand the spaces in between these toxic sites and how these ideas could be developed further?
Yes, and luckily I have wormed my way into the State Department of Toxic Substance Control and the State Water Quality Control Board, and I'm working with their staff behind the scenes, and then a week later I'll be giving testimony to the state legislature about why they need to adopt better policies. So we're working on trying to get these sites cleaned up, and we're saying the unsayable, which is that they just need to be cleaned up. No more tinkering, no more throwing, whey protein and injections into the soil. Let's just get on with it. Let's clean up the sites, 100%, because anything left there is going to be in the ocean.
Yeah. These students, mine students who are here, are working on Coney Island, and many of the problems we have is that there is no way to do this phasing. But the biggest problem I believe we have is that the definition of community is very complex there, because there's not a real, kind of empowerment or established. There's a lot of fragmentation and a lot of mobility.
There's a wonderful model for that in Oakland in a community called Fruitvale. They developed a thing called the Unity Council, where they bring organizations together in a shared council, and that has given them power. So I think we need to bring everybody, to a table and have some trust that at that table good decisions will be made that share resources.
Yeah, definitely.
It's hard in low-income areas. Everyone's on a shoestring, and they're all worried about competing for grants. So I totally get it, that it's hard and fragmented.
Yeah, thanks.
Kristina, I actually had a quick question, filler. You mentioned a couple times during the talk about seismic implications, which makes sense given the location of where you're doing this work. I was wondering if you just speak a little bit more about that, someone who's not that familiar with that. So how does concerns about seismic activity intersect with some of these proposals?
Yeah, if you're on wet soils do a thing called liquefaction. I have some slides I usually show, but if you look up liquefaction and Christchurch, you'll see images of cars that fell down into the sand that were half buried after the earthquake energy wave went past. Solid ground behaves like a liquid when the energy wave of an earthquake goes through it, if the groundwater is high and the sediment is silty or sandy. So liquefaction is a very big risk, and it requires expensive building foundations. And when the next earthquake happens, which is going to be probably a big one, probably on the East Bay side, the Oakland side, a lot of buildings are going to fall down, and 100,000 people could be displaced, living in tents in public parks. So we're facing a real crisis when that happens. We need to design for it, but unfortunately what people are doing is saying, oh, when the earthquake happens, we'll just get federal money and we'll rebuild. But that's a sad attitude because that could mean loss of life. With the ponds, if you look on the internet and you look up earthquake and swimming pool, anybody ever see any videos of what a swimming pool does in an earthquake? It sloshes in a pattern that's called seiche, the French word, S-E-I-C-H-E. And the ponds that we're talking about designing would have a seiche in an earthquake, would have a rhythmic movement of water. And if it's a long earthquake, 2 minutes or a minute and a half, could be bad. So the engineers are now designing baffles for harbors. It's a structure that looks like a waffle iron pattern in the ground, the substrate of a harbor, to prevent seiche. So that would have to be part of the pond design, is a baffle pattern in the substrate. Okay. And that keeps the water from developing that momentum. Right. So earthquakes are a very serious problem for coastal design. And every time an earthquake does happen, we see buildings fall down that are in soft soils.
The
Hi, Kristina, thank you. I just have a quick question in terms of your model. Does it only apply for housing? What about for industrial waterfronts? The reason I ask this is because I'm from LA, so in Southern California, yes, we do have beachfront properties, but we also have marginalized communities like Wilmington, for example, who are adjacent to very toxic industrial sites. Does your model, would it also work for incorporating, I guess, I don't know what the city would look like, but like an industrial waterfront in the future? Or does it propose that, what is it proposing basically for the industrial waterfront? Because the way I see it is the fact that maybe the rich people will come to the, buy the front property, but then what are you going to do with the industrial the industrial landscapes that were there before? Are they going to come further inland?
We've actually talked about that a lot because with the earthquake, we will need to rebuild. We will need big flat spaces where prefab and pre-tensioned concrete can be assembled. We'll need asphalt factories. We're going to need all the stuff it takes to rebuild an infrastructure. So we talk about having the potential for big floating platforms or flat places that are open right now and then could be used for that in the future. We've talked about stacking industrial, 2 stories at Isleas Creek in San Francisco, because a lot of it is lighter industrial than it used to be. So 2, even 3-story might be workable. It's more expensive to build the structure. And you can float anything. The Bay Area built boats out of concrete during World War II. They were called the Liberty ships, made in Marin City, among other places. And those buildings that have heavy machinery can float. We're really not talking about anything boat-like. We're talking about something that has a pontoon as part of the foundation. So I don't think there's any reason why an industrial zone can't be floated. Just that many industrial areas are kind of on the verge. They're almost subsidized in California by Prop 13. People are paying very low property taxes if they've owned the property for a long time. And that needs to stop. And then you'd see a lot of placeholder fake industries that might have 3 jobs. Those will go away, and we'll have to look for things that can actually make enough money to pay the taxes.
Your reference to Prop 13 brings up the fact that so much of this, as you've said, is about state law and regulation, because in the US, states regulate land. So part of my, and you referred to Miami, you referred to Chesapeake Bay, but if you move away from the question of just the wealthy individual and you think about wealthy communities, we had a studio here that Jenny and Linda Shai were involved in that looked at the way Boston's adaptation was harming surrounding communities. So you have models of individual things, and you talk about land trusts, and you talk about, but ultimately, right, where is the barrier going to be between the people who are controlling what's going on and the people who aren't, and who, do you need new state regulatory authorities?
Yeah,
Do you need?
I think we need to be stricter about tracking what's going wrong, because what's happening, I mean, when I first went to Cal, to UC Berkeley, they call it Cal now, I got a call from CalPERS, which is the California pension system. I'd been there about 2 years. I didn't really know who CalPERS was. And they said, we'd like to meet with you and some other faculty to talk about how to manage our real estate investments with climate change. And they wanted us to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and I said no. That was the end of that, because there was a whole industry growing up of private sector advisors who tell wealth funds how to invest. And there's a chess game that's been going on since, I don't know, 2010, about which properties to sell and which properties to buy. So even aside from the state, there's this whole shadow chess game going on in capitalism where people are playing chess, and the individual property owner, person who owns one lot, is left like it's musical chairs, you know, and they've taken all the chairs away, and now there you are, not able to find a spot. So I'm worried about that, and I'm worried that if we don't organize adaptation in a way that does have a strong role for the state or the local government, we'll find that the wealth funds have already moved all the playing pieces on the board, and what's left is very difficult to use. The state has its powers, and the private sector has its own, and the international flow of capital shapes those wealth funds. It's a lot going on. I follow the World Economic Forum just because I enjoy seeing the craziness of what's going on, and they try to talk about it in a rational way, but you can also see how just crazy it is. And there are communities, wealthy communities in California, where people are saying, you have to adopt a lower expectation of sea level rise at the government level, because they don't want their homes to lose value. But it's kind of a game of hot potato now, because you're trying to sell that property to someone else at a high price. And if your city says there's going to be 3 feet of sea level rise in 40 years, you can't sell it at that high price. But the next person won't be able to sell it at the high price. So when do we intervene with something rational when the market is not yet getting the signals? It is at the very wealthy level, but it's not at the level of someone trying to buy a house in California.
One last question.
Hi, I'm a first-year landscape grad student. This is kind of going off of the last question, but your proposal is modeled on kind of current political and economic conditions, but it's a pretty long-term strategy that's reliant on strong political entities and private collaboration. But as we know, there's a lot of kind of chaos and unpredictability, especially when those two merge. Like, how do you design a long-term strategy with this chaos in mind?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you end up making alliances with strange people. Like, I'm in with the housing developers in a weird way because they want to develop the shore. They finally want to get housing down there. And I'm encouraging them to put pressure on, but for unconventional types of housing. So they sort of tolerate me because I say there should be housing, but then they want to hear a signal from the state that this unconventional approach will be accepted and given a permit. So there's that negotiation going on. And then there's this stuff about the contaminated sites. If you really remediate a contaminated site, there's some new technology where you can electroshock the site and change some of the chemicals. But if you don't do that, you have to excavate. And if you excavate, you leave a hole. And that's where I've kind of put my chips on the board, is if we really remediate these sites and excavate them, then there's a hole. And that makes good sense to put a pine there, because it'll happen. As soon as they stop pumping the hole, it will fill with water. And we'll all look at each other and say, what are we going to do with this pond? And I will roll out my proposal. So it's a long-term strategy, but if you dig holes, you will get ponds. We have some weird contaminated ponds already that we should be talking about, that I am talking about. I feel like if I just get a floating hot dog stand, it'll be progress. Everyone will say, oh yes, look, it can float. So baby steps, make it fun. That's what the Dutch do. They turn every adaptation project into a party zone. They put out shipping containers and strings of lights. They have bands play, and they educate the public at these events. That's how we need to approach it, not like it's some hair shirt, terrible, hand-wringing, like it's a party and it's the future and we can do it. And I think that's the right way to encourage people to think about adaptation, not in this kind of dour sort of, this is all terrible. It is terrible. It's money we could have used for something else. But we have to create a positive attraction to it. Otherwise, people will walk away who have the cash. And then you just have poor people sitting in a zone that's going to flood.
So, on the positive note of a party in our future.
Shipping containers, strings of lights, fun bands.
Thank you again very much, Dr. Hill.
Thank you all.